Hello everyone. In this video, I'm going to discuss conducting and communicating research findings, at least in the context of this class and our projects. Hopefully you'll get a couple useful hints along the way as to how to conduct academic research and report your findings to, well, me among other people, but also your classmates, your peers, and whoever else might be in your future. So let's talk about this. I'm going to focus this video mostly on our projects for this class. That's going to be really my goal is to help you with that. And then you can extrapolate these lessons to other classes and the rest of your academic career. But let's talk about conducting research for your analysis paper. I think a good place for you to start at this point is to get background information on your topic. That means maybe you should start by establishing what the health issue is and finding one more source to help you understand that. If this feels a little redundant, well, it should, because you should have already done this for your proposal, but each one of you can probably find one more source, and that will get your brain working in the right direction. Ultimately, I think you'll probably put this in the introduction of your paper. I do advise you to wait to write your introduction, but go ahead and write down some of this information. My point here is that you should orient yourself to the topic before you really do the deep dive. So if someone else did all this in your proposal, then great. This is a perfect time for you to familiarize yourself with the topic more. If you did it already, easy. Then you can pull that source into your introduction later on. But at this point, let's really wrap our heads around the topic. This is a good time to you can always look at Wikipedia, you can do a Google search, you can do a library search and find an overview of this health issue. You're going to want to have scholarly sources in your paper. That's a must-have. We're not going to be citing Wikipedia. Not that you would ever do that, but try to find another source about the background of your topic. And we'll demonstrate this a little bit in terms of how we're going to be accomplishing the research and what you're going to be looking for. So to demonstrate this, I will be using a source that I just found with a quick search here. I arbitrarily decided that my topic is going to be microplastics in food and trying to reduce them. This is what you see on the example template that I uploaded to Canvas for you. So here's what that search looks like. I went to the library website, as I always do when I have half an idea of what I'm trying to find, and I simply searched microplastics in food. Now, one thing I'd like to draw your attention to in this search is that a lot of these search results are books or overviews. That's a good indication that your search might be a little bit too broad, but since I just said we're looking for kind of background information, well, this is probably sufficient for our purposes. So the source I selected is this one on top, just the first one out of the gate here. I think it takes a lot of practice to get to the point where you're going to get what you're looking for right at the top of the page. And even I don't get that all the time. I usually have to scroll a little bit. I have to refine my search a couple times, but this is fine for our purposes. This is an editorial overview. Even here in the search results, we can see some important details. We can see how current it is. That's nice. That's recent. Cool. We can see where it's coming from. We can see that it's peer reviewed. We can see that we have online access, all this good stuff, and we can see that it's probably relevant to our topic. So maybe this is a good place for me to start with my background information, and I can start assessing this source and seeing how it might fit into my project. So here's the next screen when you click on that source that pops up on the library website. I wanted to show you this just to remind you that there are some useful resources in here. If it has an abstract, you will see that here. This particular source does not have an abstract because it's only 2 pages long. It's easy to read. But if you're looking at a scholarly article, for instance, you'll usually see an abstract here, and that's really, really useful to you. You can look at that abstract and see, is this actually relevant? I'd say probably half the time I click on articles, I'm like, nah, that's not really what I'm looking for. And that's fine. If it's not really what you're looking for, don't waste any time reading it. You have other things to do. But if it does seem relevant, there's a lot that we can do here. We can print it, we can obtain a citation. That will be really useful to you because you do need citations. You might have to do a little extra formatting, but use these features that the library website provides you with to make your life easier. So if you go look at this, the abstract sounds about right, you could copy the citation, put it in your references, just double check later on to make sure that you're actually using the source and that it's formatted correctly. But in the meantime, we can go look at the source itself. You can either download the PDF or you can go directly to online access and we can learn more about this source. So here is the actual source. This is the PDF. Whenever I find a source that passes my kind of first assessment, my first glance, I download it in the form of a PDF. Now, I've said this before, I'll say it again. What's really nice about the library website is it gives you access to a lot of databases. You just got to log in with your university credentials and you can get access to articles that Google won't give you access to because there's paywalls or something else. But the university system has subscription to many of these databases. That's the whole point of academia, is to allow scholars to access this kind of information, do research, and make meaningful contributions to the world here. So this is the PDF. I download it. As soon as I download it, I save the file. I usually rename it something like author's last name plus the date and then the topic. So that's literally what I saved this file as, was She 2021 Microplastics in Food. And then I know I can always find it in my files, and that also reflects how you should be using APA format for in-text citations. Last name, year. Those are the two major pieces of the puzzle. We'll get into that a little bit more later on, but here at least you can see this article. Now, we didn't have a chance to look at an abstract on here. That's a limitation of my example, but here, this is a pretty short article. It's 2 pages long, and right here on the first page, we can see some useful information as well, right? We can see a definition, right? In the environment, plastic waste will continuously break down to small pieces, which are defined as microplastics when particle sizes are less than 5 millimeters. Well, hey, that's great. Right out of the first paragraph, I've got a definition that I can use, I can reference, and it's going to be credible, it's going to be appropriate, and that will work for my paper. So that is great, right? That is a piece of information that I already have my brain turning that I can use. So this is going to be a useful source for me, at least for overview. Now, a couple more thoughts on this actual source. This is an editorial overview. What that means is that this is the editor, this dude over here, the editor of this journal. When they have an issue, he writes this article about what is in that issue. Here's the topic, microplastics. It's interesting and important. Here's the reasons why. Here's what some of my contributors have to say. Well, for background information, that's great. It's not so specific as to really break down all of the factors, but it's probably going to mention some of the factors that I would want to talk about in my project. So an article like this would probably be a good starting point. You're going to want scholarly peer-reviewed sources in your paper, and that is non-negotiable. But you can apply these basic principles to your sources as you go forward. So let's look at some more specific tips in terms of what we're looking for in evaluating a source like this. So reading scholarly articles is a skill to be practiced. I just demonstrated that a little bit. I've done this for about 20 years now. It's much easier for me to be able to do stuff like this than probably it is for you. But the fact that it's a skill means a couple of things. One, it doesn't come naturally to most people. Some people might have a predisposition for it, but this is not something that you're born being able to do. Two, it can be practiced, and it should be practiced. Not just for the sake of your college career, but for real life. I mean, obviously I'm a little biased. I'm an academic, and so I do this kind of stuff for a living. But also when I encounter a question that I have about the world, about, if someone makes a claim about health or politics or something else or science, I go to the library website and I try and search it and try and find some sources so that I can get to the bottom of it. If I go read a Washington Post article that sounds really interesting or really suspicious and they reference a study, I read the study. I go look at the study. I read the abstract and I apply these skills to determine if it seems like they're misconstruing it at all. And you don't need to have a PhD to be able to do this. The skills I'm about to discuss should help you accomplish that. So a quick glance at a scholarly article can help you determine if it's going to be useful for you, if it's credible, etc. So in your quick glance, you get your source, you did what we just did, you've narrowed down your search terms and found your article, and you're looking at it to see if it's relevant. So first of all, how current is it? And how much does that matter? You can ask yourself that question too. If you're looking at a topic like COVID-19, well, the more current, the better, because things are developing all the time. If you're looking at something that's well established, such as like diet or exercise, well, you're not going to have to worry as much about that. We've been talking about that for all of humanity. So something that's coming from the 90s is probably not going to be as outdated as it would be if it were talking about coronaviruses. But you get the idea there. Is it relevant? That's a good question to ask yourself. If it isn't relevant, don't use it. Don't read it. Don't waste your time, unless you're really curious about the topic. But, maybe save that in a different folder for later, not, taking your time that you dedicated to the project looking at it. What kind of resource is it? It should be scholarly. It should be peer reviewed. You can look at where it was published. You can assess those journals as well. And but also, what kind of resource is it in the sense that I just showed you an editorial overview? That's different than a experiment or a peer-reviewed study. So you'll want to kind of learn those differences, or at least ask yourself the question of what am I looking at, right? It wouldn't be appropriate to reference this as a study. It would be appropriate to reference it as an editorial opinion, right? Where was it published? How credible is the journal? I assume that the journal known as Food Science is fairly credible. We can do a little more research into that, see its impact factor, things like that. What you want to look out for are journals that are pay to publish. If you can determine that, that might be a sign that it's not a very good journal. They're just moving people through. They're not taking a very close look at what they're publishing in those kind of sources. But that's just one example of something to avoid. So back to our example, right? Current opinion in food science. That's a pretty prominent journal. You see the usual kind of suspects here. It's available online at Science Direct. That's pretty typical. You can learn something about this guy here. You can see what kind of credentials he has. We can assess all these different things. And again, we can see the currentness of this article. Microplastics are kind of an emerging concern, so I'm satisfied that this is a fairly recent piece of information. Now, once you've got that source, you can do all that before you even look at the paper, right? You can do that through the library website. You can assess it quickly to see how relevant it might be to your current project. Once you're looking at this, most of the time you can read the abstract as well through the library website. So look at the abstract and make sure it's relevant. I can't say that enough. If you read the abstract and you're like, that's not really what I'm talking about, well, then you are under no obligation to go any further with that source. There's a lot of information out there that you can go gather. If you were reading this source and you got just admired in all the methods and stuff and you got confused, you'd be really mad at yourself for spending the time on that, because I promise you, if you do that, you're probably going to find a way to pull it into your paper, whether it's relevant or not, and that's not going to help your grade. That will detract from your grade. So, is this relevant to your topic? How would you explain that to someone? If someone asked you, oh, cool, what's that article about and why are you looking at it? Can you answer that in a couple sentences? I'm looking at microplastics in food to see if there's something we can do on college campuses to minimize our exposure. And this article gives me a really interesting overview of current research about microplastics. Ta-da! There's my elevator pitch. That helps me establish that this is in fact relevant to me and my project. The article itself. When you get to the article, you can also be more efficient about reading through it and processing that information. It took me kind of an embarrassingly long time when I was in grad school to figure out how to do this effectively. I took a break from school. So when I graduated undergrad, before I came back and became a master's student, I changed my attitude about school and was like, yeah, I really want to learn stuff. I want to be really focused, really dedicated. And so I spent a lot of time reading articles cover to cover and trying to understand everything within them. That's not really the purpose, because most articles, if you're in the sciences, for instance, you're going to encounter a lot of articles with methodologies that you're not an expert in, that you're not familiar with. And if you want to learn more about those methodologies, that's great. But at this stage of your career, you shouldn't be trying to interpret a bunch of really technical expertise and methodologies, unless you're doing a research methods class or something like that. But for your general purposes, you don't need to look at stuff like that at as great of detail as you might later on, or if you were someone like me who's actually trying to assess articles at a deeper level. At this stage, you may not even read it in order. So here's some tips in terms of how to look at an article and get it processed by your brain so that you can situate that information into your big picture for your paper. So you probably won't understand the methods. Don't worry about that. If you start with the introduction, that will give you critical background and overview of your topic, much like it should do probably in your paper. I've asked you in that template to start with your introduction, give me an overview of that health issue and how it relates to the factors that you're looking at and that kind of stuff. Likewise, if you go look at a scholarly article, that's what you're going to find. The introduction is going to give that critical background and overview of the topic. So it's pretty useful in that way. Typically, the discussion section of science, hard or soft science papers, the discussion section is going to be the most interesting, right? Because that's where they get to talk about the implications of their findings. If they're doing an experiment, they'll say what all those results mean. If you go read the results section, again, it's going to be kind of dependent on how familiar you are with the methods, how much sense that's going to make to you. But the discussion section is usually the most interesting part of the paper and can tell you a lot about the implications of that subject. The conclusion usually states implications most clearly and might direct you to better questions to ask and answer. So if it's not totally relevant and not really what you're looking for, make sure you scan that conclusion and see if they're talking about other research that should be performed. That might help you refine your search terms or something along those lines. It might direct you to other resources that might be useful to you. And if it is relevant, this is going to really, the conclusion should be connecting the implications talked about in the discussion back to the introduction and say, well, given this huge topic, here's what we learned and why it's important. So if you look at these major areas, you're going to be in pretty good shape to use that resource for something like the analysis paper. Now, after you've done this with maybe your background information or your health issue, it's time to move on to your next most influential factor. So again, maybe you look in the conclusion, they say there needs to be more research on this thing. Well, go see if there is more research on that thing. That thing might be your next most influential factor, but you should decide what that is. You're going to have probably more than one factor that you're looking at in your project. If that's the case, prioritize them and do which one you think is more important. Do you think you have a clear understanding as to how that factor influences your health issue? And again, how specific can you be in your search? If you're like, all right, here's the most important factor, and you go to that search and you get a whole bunch of books popping up on there. Well, you're probably not refining your search enough. You should be a little bit more targeted. Again, if you looked at the background information in a different source, that might help you be more specific. More specificity usually leads to better results. You're going to find diminishing returns on that, of course, where if you're overly specific, you're not going to find anything, or you're going to find something that's just way too technical that you didn't even know existed. So you might have to dial it back at that point. But keep this in mind. Be more specific with your search terms, right? If we're investigating a specific relationship, don't just type in diabetes. Good luck sorting through that. Type in diabetes and diet. Diabetes and sugar consumption, the effect of vegetables on diabetes, right? Something around there is probably going to get you closer to peer-reviewed studies that are going to be useful for your topic and give you appropriate information. Now, another mistake I see people make when they're doing academic research in the early stages, it's not really a mistake so much as a barrier. I've asked you to look at a specific community, right? And I'm asking you to justify what that community is, whether it's the Whitewater campus or Walworth County or Wisconsin or the United States or college students or whatever it may be. It's kind of up to you to establish what that community is. But if you're having trouble, for instance, finding information about your city that you live in, that's not surprising, right? Not every single topic has been researched for every single community in the world. And so what you're going to need to do is draw comparisons from a comparable group or situation. So ask yourself, what is your key group or your primary audience? Is it college students? Well, that's easy to answer. Is it people with lower or higher socioeconomic backgrounds? Well, you can find comparable populations that way as well. But think about what that key demographic is, and if you can find information about a comparable population in a comparable setting, that's usually enough justification for you to draw a comparison and say, okay, binge drinking is a problem among college students. Here's a study from University of Wyoming, and here's a study from the University of whatever, London. And then you can compare across those groups, right? Binge drinking in college students probably isn't going to be that different across all those different groups. But what really matters is whether or not you can establish that connection. So you have to explain that. You don't just take the source and throw it in and say, yeah, see, obviously Walworth County, right? No, you have to rationalize it. But you don't need something that is specific to the group that you're talking about right now necessarily. It needs to be related to them. And you have to be able to explain to your reader and me what that relationship is. That's usually enough justification to talk about the thing. So, can you find information regarding similar groups? If you can find something in the same demographics, that's usually enough. And whatever you do, explaining how your sources are relevant is essential. So you don't want to be in a situation where the reader is like, why are they talking about this? Never, ever. And you definitely don't want your instructor questioning that either. We're busy people, we got lots of papers to read, right? So the last thing you want is me to be reading through your paper and be like, why are they spending 2 pages talking about this thing that's completely irrelevant to what they say they're talking about? To me, that suggests that you just took the first thing that came up on the search and you're desperately, desperately trying to make sure you hadn't wasted time reading that and you're just plugging it in as best you can. So again, hopefully my tips help you avoid that problem, but whatever you do, explain how your sources are relevant to your topic. That's half the paper right there. This is an analysis paper. And if you're worried about like page counts or word counts or whatever, well, the more you explain your sources, the better off you're going to be. So that leads me to outlining/writing the report. In this case, I gave you a template and you should probably use it. I gave that to you for a couple of reasons. I wrote it in the style that is common to APA format, with headings and subheadings, and I've written comments on that document to help you understand what those subheadings and headings are and what they're supposed to accomplish. But I also gave you that template to familiarize you with kind of the structure of what academic articles are going to look like, because most of the sources you look at are going to follow a similar pattern, right? An introduction, a relevant literature review. If they're an experiment or a study, they're usually going to have methods and results, but then they're going to have discussion and they're going to have conclusion, right? So I want you to get in the habit of thinking in that way, because that's going to be really useful to you. So the template is also going to help you flesh out your ideas enough so you're not just, kind of shooting in the dark here in terms of like, am I at, 1,000 words yet? I don't know. Am I going to enough depth? Like word count and page count does not matter. I mean, it does, but it doesn't matter nearly as much as, are you talking about the topic to sufficient depth? Are you digging into it enough? Are you going into enough detail? And hopefully the template should help you suss that out. So most APA style documents and scholarly articles in general have these kinds of clear headings, subheadings, and format. And that's for good reason. The whole point of APA style is to be as clear and concise as possible while exploring large bodies of literature. If you're doing something like an English paper, well, you don't need APA format. You may hate APA format, that's fine, but it serves a specific purpose, and this is it. If you're writing about like a Shakespearean sonnet, you're not going to be referencing hundreds of articles or whatever. If you're doing something in the social sciences, you might be referencing 50 to 100 articles. You might have a really huge reference section. Not here, obviously, but the whole point is that we're with things like this, articles or papers and studies in this vein, we are looking at large bodies of literature and we're synthesizing them in as clear a way as possible and concisely as possible. And so we're going to be pulling in different articles in a single paragraph or even in a single sentence. And so APA style is just designed to help you sort out that information and quickly communicate the credibility of that information. Now, you should also practice integrating citations and references into your writing. You can see some examples of that in Well, in the example template I've provided you, this can be a little bit of a problem sometimes. I've seen on exams or essays in the past. As an undergrad, maybe you're just not that used to writing in this way, but I think you should do it now, and you should get accustomed to that. Not only does that protect you from plagiarism issues and academic misconduct, but it helps you write the paper. If you're someone who's worried about like page counts or something, typing up those citations as you go makes your life easier, and it gives you more to talk about, and it allows you to be most importantly, clearer for your audience. So get in that habit now. It makes your writing more transparent, easier to follow, and it makes it easier for you to keep track of what you're doing. So also keep in mind the goal of the paper and don't get too distracted. So writing with citations in this way can help you focus because you are always bringing those sources in and tying them to what you're talking about in the present moment. Now, as you're writing things up and you're integrating those sources, you have to balance how much information to include there. So include as much information as necessary to establish credibility and to get your point across and support what you're talking about. I recommend as you write this report, this specific paper, you start with the background first. I mentioned earlier here that I don't think you should write the introduction until you've written the rest. That's a good standing practice for any kind of paper you're writing because you don't know what you're going to say until you've said it. And it's much, much easier to go write the introduction last rather than write it and then have to come back to it because most people are too lazy to come back to it and then their introduction doesn't match the rest of the paper. So start with that literature review and then do the introduction last. Because as you start researching these things, your head's going to start churning through these factors, through all this new information. You're going to get excited about it. Sure, I promise. And then you can just start writing that into that literature review and not worrying about tying it all together yet. So start with that. So here is the example I've provided you, including the comments here. You can see I'm using that same article I mentioned earlier, that editorial commentary, and I'm just kind of plugging it in here as an example of a project. So maybe I've got my project title, Don't Eat Plastic. Program goal, this should all be the same as your proposal, right? Unless you've changed it, which is fine if you discovered something in the research, right? My program goal is to reduce the exposure to microplastics in food on college campuses. Okay, up in the introduction, you can kind of see the beginnings of an introduction. I'm writing the way I write, and so I don't expect you to sound exactly this academic, but this can give you a goal as to what it should sound like. We'll talk about composition next, but here we go. So this project aims to reduce college students' exposure to microplastics in their food supply. Overall, we propose that targeting dietary habits on campus is most likely to help avoid contaminants of all kinds while improving overall health. This paper analyzes X specific factors that play a role in the relationship between microplastic consumption and dietary choices. First, the ubiquity of microplastics in the food chain will be considered. Next, limitations of food choices on campus will be explored. Finally, blah, 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 blah. You get the idea. So a good introduction is going to clearly establish the topic, the health issue, and why I'm talking about these different things. Next, you do see the review of the relevant literature, including the subheadings that I've put in here. And again, the template, you can put in more or less subheadings, but I just wanted to give you a sense as to what this should look like. Right? So maybe my first factor that I'm looking at on this analysis paper is microplastics in the food chain. And you can see I pulled in our source already to do this. And I said, there are ongoing concerns about many contaminants in the food chain and the role they might play in human health. Microplastics are one factor that researchers are actively exploring as a concern because they are found in so many different places. Reference SHE 2021. That's that article we talked about. Next, I established that article. You could do this in out of order too, right? I could talk about the article first and then explain how it's relevant. But one way or another, we want to do both of these things. We want to apply the article, but as soon as I've mentioned that article, I should probably explain how it's relevant and credible. And so that's what I'm doing in this next sentence. I say, Wahong Shi, a professor of environmental sciences at East China Normal University, described the process by which microplastics end up in food in a 2021 editorial overview. I'm establishing what the source is, who wrote it, when it was written, what their credibility is, and what it's about, all in that one sentence. Does that seem a little tedious and redundant to you? Well, it might be a little bit, but again, if you're worried about trying to do your word count, if you're doing stuff like this in there, you're never going to run out of stuff to talk about, right? And you're establishing the credibility, you're increasing the transparency, and you're giving me more information in terms of your topic. Okay, so according to Shi, 2021, plastic waste continues to break down in the environment into increasingly small pieces, blah, 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 right? You get the idea here, I hope. So that's kind of what it should be doing, but it's got these in-text citations. Notice I am talking about the source, establishing its credibility, and I'm integrating it all at the same time. And once you've established that credibility, that's fine, right? You don't have to keep saying, Wang Hongxi, a professor of environment. You have one sentence about that, and then after that, you just do stuff like this, and you say, have your in-text citation. As long as you're clear and attributing where the information and the material came from. As a side note, we very rarely use direct quotes in APA format because it's very rare that the direct quote is going to be saying exactly what you want to communicate to your audience. What you're going to be doing is taking the information that you gain from that article and applying it in a specific context. But you're always being very clear what information you're taking from that source, right? So specifically, I am communicating to my audience that I am taking the information that she talks about microplastics breaking down in the environment. I'm taking that piece of information from that article. And next time I pull another piece of information from that article, I'm still going to reference it using this kind of in-text citation. And I want to be very clear about that for the transparency of my article and or for my paper, as well as establishing credibility and avoiding academic misconduct. Now, also visible here, you can see the discussion. Like I said, I think this is probably your most interesting part of your paper, and this will probably be the most fun to write. So once you've done your literature review, move on to that. So here I get to say things like, as she pointed out, we do not know the health effects of microplastics. And again, she 2021, that's in-text citation APA format. However, the same steps needed to reduce microplastics in our diet can also lead to better dietary practices in general. Comparing this understanding to the lack of healthy food options on campus, and presumably I would have another citation for that, we can see that it's increasingly important to minimize the amount of processed food college students choose to eat. Now, obviously I'm speculating here because I'm not talking about another source, but I wanted to demonstrate to you how this should be written. And when you get to that discussion section, that's when you're starting to synthesize the interesting parts of the paper. What did you learn by comparing these sources? What does it tell you about your health issue? And what does it tell you about what we can do? Once you get to the conclusion down here, well, that's where you might start applying that information a bit more, right? Based on what I just said in my discussion, I think that there's an opportunity for focusing on college students as a primary audience through maybe informational posters. And so a secondary audience might be this, but you can see what I'm doing there. Now I'm moving the discussion along from this. The main purpose of this whole paper is talking about these factors, but here in the conclusion, it's an opportunity to be like, here's why I was looking at those factors. Remember, I mentioned it in the beginning. Now here we are in the conclusion. I'm explaining to you why I looked at these factors, and why I'm looking at those factors is to complete this project and develop an intervention. And so here are some of the implications for that. You shouldn't really be using the conclusion to introduce any new arguments. Those new arguments should be coming in the discussion section, but the conclusion is your opportunity to tie it all together. And that means, in this case, explaining what you learned through reading about this and how that applies to your project. Don't worry about doing that until you get to the discussion and the conclusion. Don't really worry about doing that throughout in the literature review. The literature review is really for establishing what you learned from those papers and why it's important. But down at the end here in the conclusion, that's your chance to say, because of that, here's the direction we're going in with our project. Okay? Okay. Hopefully that gives you a sense as to how to conduct the research and start drafting that paper. I really hope that helps and makes your lives easier. That is what I'm trying to do after all. Now, I'd like to spend the remainder of this video just briefly covering some best practices in composition for academic writing. That may not sound very exciting to you either, but again, this is designed to make your life easier because there are a lot of common issues I see in academic writing. Some of these were in the first exam and the essay questions there. And so hopefully we can nip some of this in the bud and make your lives easier there and have better writing going forward. So first of all, for these papers, I'm just going to go ahead and say it's okay to use the first person. However, there's a reason why you learned not to do that in high school. We want arguments, not opinions. And so if you do use first person, well, just ask yourself what purpose does it serve? Usually it's not adding much of anything. Now, specifically in your exams, I asked your opinion, right? I said, what factors, for instance, do you think are going to be most influential in this given context or whatever, and why? But that and why is the part that you should really focus on. So an opinion is not justified. It's just, I feel like this, I think this. But an argument is that plus evidence and reasoning. So you want to build those proper arguments. I'm not going to ding you for points if you use I. However, you should try to not weaken your arguments with unnecessary language, filler, or subjective musing. We'll look at some examples after this so you can see what I'm talking about. There is a time for speculation and a proper way to do it. The discussion section is probably where you're going to do most of your speculation, but you still need to be very clear what is your speculation and why you believe it, most importantly. It is not important for, I know it's your opinion if you're saying this seems to suggest whatever, but what's more important is why you think that that is suggested by the research. Proofread, for the love of God. Proofread, read it aloud. That's one of the single most important recommendations I have ever made to people regarding composition. Don't write it once and let it go. Even I make mistakes, and I'm really, really good at writing. But every time I read my stuff, I see typos. I see sentences that are way too long. I see things that need to be explained more. Proofread. Do it. Give yourself time to do it. It's really obvious when you don't do this, and it doesn't make you look very smart. So go back and read what you wrote and read it aloud. The reason I say read it aloud is because that helps you determine if the language you're using is human language. You use different parts of your brain to process things written versus orally or hearing it, right? So proofread. Read it aloud. Does it sound sane to you? How many breaths did you have to take in that sentence? If it's 4 lines long and you had to take a couple breaths, well, it's probably too long and you should break it up. And hey, bonus, again, if you are someone who's worried about, like, if you're intimidated by page counts or word counts or whatever, if you've got a 4-line sentence, hey, you could break that up and write a whole paragraph about that, right? So this is a common thing I saw when people would come visit me when I worked at the Writing Center many years ago, is they'd be like, I don't have anything else to say. I'm like, really? How about this? You break down this 4-line sentence into like 2 paragraphs and explain what you mean, because it might make sense to you, particularly if you're reading it quietly to yourself. But if you read it aloud and you engage with that stuff, you might be like, that really needs more explanation. And you could break up a run-on sentence into whole paragraphs, right? And that's good. That's not just good for you in terms of if you're scared of page counts and meeting them. It's good for your reader because we know what you're actually saying. And I mentioned the Writing Center. Hey, we have one here on campus. Go use it. Use it if you're a good writer. Use it if you're a bad writer. Use it if you're anyone. Just use it, because it really helps to have someone look at what you wrote and give you a second opinion. Much like it helps if you read it aloud to yourself so that you can hear what you wrote and engage with the words. The Writing Center is going to be really good for that. So let's look at some examples. This video is already getting long, so hopefully we can round this out and you can feel confident going forward in your papers. Here's an example of a sentence I recently saw on one of my 363 exams. Let's read it and see what we can do about it. I feel a good way to overcome these challenges are a good level of communication, because when you are going to see a provider, you want to get everything out so that you know you are healthy and there's no underlying condition you have or need treatment for. What kind of problems do you see in this sentence? Well, I can notice a few. Let's highlight them. First of all, we've got this subjective language here. It doesn't add anything. Look at that. The sentence does not change in any way other than for the better if I remove I feel. A good way to overcome these challenges are a good level of communication, right? That right there is way more straightforward, way more confident, and it doesn't distract. If I read, I feel a good way to overcome, I'm like, oh, really? You feel? How sure are you about that? That just kind of weakens the language. Now, we also see that this is a 4-line run-on sentence. There's too much happening here. Break it up. I would, delete things, extraneous language. I would delete that comma and put a period there, and then I would explain what else I want to see. I would also remove the personal language of when you are going to see a provider. What do you mean you? Me? Me? Is it only me? Right? Obviously, that's not what you mean. You should say when a patient goes to see a provider, et cetera, et cetera. It's an opportunity not just to strengthen the language, but to be clearer and more specific. So I just took the liberty of rewriting this into 2 different sentences. A good way to overcome these challenges would be to improve patient-provider communication. It is important for patients to feel confident that all of their concerns are addressed when they see a doctor. Hey, look at that. We broke this into 2 sentences. We eliminated the weak language. That sounds much more confident, much clearer. I don't have to read it 3 times to guess what the meaning is. So there you go. That's one. Here's another one. This was having to do with the different levels of analysis. And so we have, in a meso example, you can preach health knowledge to a big group of people and make a very significant impact on society. Well, this isn't really a run-on sentence. In fact, this sentence is kind of vague and unclear, and I think there's a lot that we could unpack here. I can guess what the author is trying to say, but I shouldn't have to. You should say it more clearly, right? So what do we mean by a meso example? What is meso? If this is on an exam, well, you should explain that, right? I want to know that you know what those words are, and it also makes it easier to understand what you're saying. So explain. Why are you talking about meso? What does that mean? Right? It's the meso level of analysis, etc. There's obviously some grammatical errors in here and some word choice issues. We could probably find a better word than preach. That's a very connotative word. It's got some connotations tied up in it, usually religious connotations. Anyway, you get the idea there. There's also a spelling error that could be avoided if you just proofread. So here's a simpler way of saying this. Communicating health knowledge to larger groups can have more significant impacts on society. Okay, much simpler. Right? We still don't know what a meso example is, but that's kind of a separate matter. You should be clear about things like that as well, but here at least we know what the sentence is supposed to say now. It still needs some explanation, as it is not a very profound statement on its own. So keep that in mind as well. If it feels like you're stating the obvious in a paper or an exam, you're probably not. You should explain what you mean. Don't leave it up for interpretation, particularly when your grade's on the line. All right, here's our last example. I feel like people in the media explaining to the public what different illnesses and viruses there are can educate the masses about staying healthy and going to the doctor to either treat or prevent these viruses or illnesses. Again, we have a run-on sentence here. It's not very clear, and if we read it a couple times and figure out what it's trying to say, it's not particularly profound in its own right. It's not saying a whole lot. So let's see what we can do about this. Well, again, we should probably eliminate the personal language, as discussed previously. We could establish what this means a little bit more, and we could be more direct in saying it. People in the media explaining to the public what different illnesses and viruses there are. There are simpler ways to say that, more direct ways. We should do that. So we also have staying healthy and going to the doctor to either treat or prevent these viruses and illnesses. That's like saying the same thing several different ways. It just detracts from the clarity. What else can we do about this? Well, here's how I rewrote it. Maybe that makes more sense to us. I tried to be more specific in what I meant with that and what was meant with that first statement. Media commentators could help educate lay people about the importance of both health and health care. So I've removed some of the redundant language and I've added some specificity, right? People in the media commentators, could help educate lay people. Lay people is another word for the public. The public's fine though, maybe this is just a word preference, but we've simplified the language and we've made it clearer. They could also provide important health information to improve health literacy. So rather than saying things like staying healthy and going to the doctor to either treat or prevent these viruses and illnesses, what am I trying to accomplish with that rambling kind of statement? It's not super clear. So we want to think about how we can say that clearer. It sounds like we're talking about health literacy and conveying important health information. So there you have it. There's a couple examples of and some suggestions in terms of how we can improve our writing. I've tried to keep this video as concise as possible. Speaking of being precise and concise, I hope you found it useful. If you're struggling with any of this, as always, please email me, set up a meeting. I'm happy to help and I love to do so. So I hope this goes well for you. Good luck and take care.